Bismillah. This is Field Notes Occupation, a Noble Savagery production. I'm Dr. Zara Khan. In today's episode, I'm going to introduce this course, which is a report back from 2 weeks of fieldwork conducted in the West Bank of Palestine in August of 2003. Along with several of my colleagues from New York City, under the guidance of the New York Solidarity Movement for Free Palestine, we traveled to the West Bank to explore what life for everyday Palestinians is like under Israeli military occupation. The New York Solidarity Movement for Free Palestine is made of people from the Malcolm X grassroots movement as well as the Prison Moratorium Project. On our trip, the members of our delegation recorded audio, recorded video, took still photography, and, like myself, transcribed the everyday occurrences that we witnessed and transcribed interviews. Our hope was to come back to our communities in New York City, to our churches and masajid, to our colleges and high schools and universities and workplaces and community centers, and share with people testimonials and firsthand accounts of everyday Palestinian people in their plight to survive and try to thrive under a very oppressive regime of a military occupation. We visited 7 cities in the West Bank and 4 refugee camps. We were not able to go to Gaza in those days because in the 3 weeks leading up to our trip, 200 homes had been demolished, mostly in Gaza, but also in Jenin and Nablus. And we limited our trip to the West Bank. We met with some members of the International Solidarity Movement in Jordan prior to entering the West Bank, and there we were told by one young woman from Germany that Gaza was a bloodbath, and she had been kicked out of Gaza by the Israeli authorities, threatened to have her passport permanently confiscated, and so we limited our fieldwork and fact-finding mission to the West Bank. We were able to collect eyewitness and local reports and testimonials from the people who we spoke with. We spoke with everyday people, women, men, and children. We spoke with victims of trauma and torture. We spoke with activists and organizers, Jewish as well as Palestinian. We spoke with farmers and doctors, teachers and merchants, students, people who are members of non-governmental organizations, government officials, and other members of the international community visiting the West Bank. So the focus of this course is going to be fivefold, and each of these represents a broad area of human rights discourse. Universal human rights discourse pertains to a number of areas of human life, and I'm going to be focusing on these 5 themes. The first one, which we look at today, is policing, intimidation, and checkpoints. After that, we will also have episodes dealing with water, healthcare, and refugee camps, with education, women's rights, and the social fabric, with collective punishment and torture, with religious freedom in the Holy Land. After that, I will have one more episode as a summary analysis to speak in general about the meaning and implication of this vicious cycle of violence that we find for those living under Israeli military occupation. So let's begin with our first topic for today's episode is policing, intimidation, and checkpoints. When we first arrived and entered the West Bank of Palestine, it was through the Kalandia checkpoint in Ramallah, just outside Ramallah. And while we were waiting to be processed through the checkpoint, we counted 15 shots fired in 15 minutes. That was our very first impression of the West Bank and our welcome to the area. Checkpoints are characterized by harassment. There is daily hassling at checkpoints. People are turned back all the time for no reason at all. Sometimes a reason is given. Sometimes people are told, try again tomorrow. Sometimes they're not told anything at all, and passage is not allowed. Now, a checkpoint cuts up the streets and areas that surround it and channels mobility and movement. So the people of Palestine do not enjoy freedom of movement within their own land. If a student is trying to get to school, they will have to pass through a checkpoint often. Teachers going to the classroom to teach will have to pass through checkpoints, and often people are denied. In a later episode, When we talk about torture, we'll deal with a United Nations report that showed a grave concern for the number of Palestinian women who were forced to give birth at checkpoints, women who came upon a checkpoint to get to a hospital while they were actively in labor, who were refused passage, who had their babies on the side of the road in the mud, and many of whose babies died because of that. Fathers cutting umbilical cords with rocks and so on. But we will deal with that in a subsequent episode. For most Palestinians in the West Bank, the checkpoints represented obstacles to the movement of goods and services and just everyday life, students, teachers, etc. Later in our trip, one woman who we spoke to, an elementary school teacher who had 2 of her own children with her, was refused entry at the same checkpoint. We were able to speak with her. And where was she going? She was going to her classroom. Even though all of her working and travel documents were in order, she was turned away. And this is while the checkpoint was open and operational. Later that same evening at 10:15 p.m., 3 of our delegation members attempted to cross through the same checkpoint, even though it had already closed at 9:30 p.m. The Israeli soldiers who were there spoke with them and checked their passports, and they came to find out they were Americans. Our delegation members told the soldiers that they were going into Tel Aviv for a good time. Now, they were not going into Tel Aviv for a good time. They were going to continue the documentation and the purpose for which we had arrived in the West Bank. And the soldiers let them go, even though the checkpoint was officially closed at that point. They did also point out to them 3 Palestinian men who they had sitting and squatting on the side of the road under their supervision, and these they were using as human shields. And the soldiers, in speaking with our delegation members who were crossing over into Israel, were joking with them and laughing and telling them that, if they were to be attacked at the checkpoint while they were on duty there, that these 3 Palestinian men would serve as their human shields, which of course is illegal in international law. Hebron on a Saturday afternoon when we arrived was under curfew. Now, an hour before Israelis had fired live shots downhill from the Aliyah hospital, 2 members of our sister delegation from Chicago, we met up with a group of people who were also coming to document life under occupation in the West Bank. They had come from Chicago, we had come from New York, and when we arrived in Ramallah, we had met up and formed a larger contingent. So 2 of the members of the Chicago delegation in Hebron earlier that day had dodged rubber bullets and had been affected by tear gas canisters that had been fired down the street. A few hours before we arrived in Hebron, 2 Palestinian teenagers had been shot, 14 years old and 16 years old. Both had been hit in the legs, and the younger one had also been hit in his back. According to the people in Hebron that we spoke with, shootings occur every single day. The first stop that we took in our visit to Hebron was a kindergarten and daycare center operated by the Union of Palestinian Women. It was 1 block away from the hospital. We took a taxi from H1 to H2. Hebron is divided into 2 sections as of the Oslo Peace Accords of 1993 and 1995. There was an Israeli settlement just down the road in the center of Hebron, the Kiryat Village 4. This settlements are illegal according to international law, but Israel has consistently built and expanded settlements and the number of settlers in the West Bank for, since 1967. So this particular settlement has 15,000 settlers, and on this Saturday afternoon, those of you who are familiar with the Jewish practice of observing the Sabbath know that, and it's a beautiful thing to observe. I myself was raised in Brooklyn, and I'm very familiar with the sight of Jewish families and groups of friends on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in their best, walking down the street, observing the Sabbath. And so we were able to observe this same practice here in the Jewish settlement in Hebron. However, because it was the Sabbath, the entire city was under curfew for Palestinian residents. Now, when there is a curfew, no man, woman, or child may leave the home. Palestinian may leave the home. If they do, they can and will be shot by Israeli soldiers. And so, in order for the Jewish settlers in Hebron to feel good and safe about their walks on a Saturday afternoon during Sabbath, all of the Palestinians were made to be enclosed in their homes until the Sabbath observation was over. Between the settlers and us at this checkpoint that you see in the photo, there were cinder blocks, sandbags, and 3 remote sniper towers, as well as 5 rifle-toting soldiers. They took our passports. They took 2 representatives from our group, and they were asking why we were visiting Hebron, why we wanted to visit Hebron, and they told us that there was a curfew, and they told us that, if there's a soldier that doesn't know, for example, myself and my mother, as well as the woman who was our Palestinian guide through Hebron, that there would be no guarantee that we would not be shot at once we are in Hebron, even though, of course, Israeli intelligence being as sophisticated and efficient as it is, they would, of course, the soldiers within the settlement in Hebron would know that we are visitors coming to visit Hebron. But nonetheless, my mother really wanted to visit the Haram Ibrahimi. This is a holy site where it's the sanctuary of Abraham. And Prophet Abraham, his wife Sarah, and their son, Prophet Isaac, as well as their grandson, Prophet Jacob, are believed to be buried in this site atop a hilltop in Hebron. So myself, my mother, we also wanted to visit for this purpose, but of course our primary reason in visiting the West Bank and Hebron specifically, and all of the other cities we visited, was to document life under occupation. But we were told that we would be able to pass, and 11 of us could pass, but the woman who was our guide, a Palestinian woman, that she would have to wait here at the checkpoint. So after considering this condition and out of solidarity for Palestinian people and their dignity, we did not enter that part of Hebron, and so we left. City closures are very common in Palestine. Sometimes a whole city would be closed. No one could go in or out, and this is, decisions made by Israeli Defense Forces and implemented by the soldiers on the ground who make up the physical architecture of occupation. During our very short 2 weeks in the West Bank, at some point, the following cities were all fully closed, and we had to rework our itinerary in order to be able to visit those places later on, and this included Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarem, Kalkilia, and Hebron.